So first, decolonizing anti-racism. So when we think about anti-racism in Canada, North America maybe, in general, we think about racism against visible minorities, people of color. Okay? So we can think about the history of racism against Asians. Okay? So for example, head tax. This was imposed on only Chinese immigrants in 1885, and it lasted for more than 40 years, okay, which prevented Chinese immigrants to be competitive economically with the other settlers, white settlers and settlers of color. And then the anti-Asian riot in 1907 in Vancouver, which really disenfranchised Asian immigrants in the area. And there was 1914 Komagata Maru incident, where more than 300 Punjabi people who made a voyage across Pacific were denied access, entry to Canada, even though they were British subjects. And exclusion of Chinese students from public education in the 1920s in British Columbia. Tim Stanley has talked about it. The reason was that the school system was suffering from overcrowdedness, and the argument was that these Chinese immigrants were not really ready to be enrolled in the regular program. Even though some of the Chinese immigrants at that time were born in Canada and speakers of English. And then internment of Japanese Canadians in 1942. And also there has been racism against black scholars. This is more contemporary, and I need to learn more about the history of black experiences in Canada. But Annette Henry, Anthony Stewart, and others have talked about the challenges of black scholars in higher education in Canada. However, we need to understand that Canada is a settler colony which originally belonged to Aboriginal people. And the anti-racist movement is, as I mentioned, is typically discussed about the racial tension and racism between white settlers and settlers of color. But visible minorities are also, in fact, settlers of Canada. So Lawrence and Dewar argue that non-white settlers are indeed complicit in the ongoing colonization of Aboriginal people. And I started to look at history between Aboriginal people and non-white settlers, particularly in British Columbia. This is under-researched, and I'm not a specialist on this, but I will just give you some overview of the issue that I have learned. Maybe there are more information, something that I miss, or something that need to be added. But there were close encounters between Stolo, the indigenous people, and Chinese gold miners, railroad laborers, merchants, farmers, and so on in the mid to late 19th century. in British Columbia, when Stolo men, for example, worked alongside Chinese men with sometimes higher wages on railroad construction in 1880s. Historical records describe unions between Stolo women and Chinese men, which need to be understood in the context where Chinese settlers were almost all men and were imposed a head tax, and therefore they most desired to have access to land. Economic competitions among people of color is illustrated in the fishing industry, which became dominated by Japanese fishermen. Their market domination disenfranchised Aboriginal men who depended on fishing as a main economic means. Between Japanese and Stolo people, negative perceptions toward each other apparently existed. But the competition between Chinese and Japanese men were less conspicuous because many Chinese men in the fishing industry employed Stolo women in canneries rather than engaging in fishing. Among diverse groups of people, the division of labor and unequal salaries clearly existed. Aboriginal women and Chinese men were involved in cutting and packing fish, while Aboriginal, European, and Japanese men were engaged in fishing. A disparity of wages certainly reflected the workers' race and gender. However, the increased sense of disenfranchisement led Stolo leaders to demand that the government increase their wages in order to compensate for the loss of their employment caused by Chinese, Japanese, and South Asian immigrants. So you see clear power relations, unequal power relations between settlers of color and indigenous people, and among settlers of color. So in that sense, we need to decolonize anti-racism by looking at power relations between indigenous people and settlers of color, and among settlers of color.